July 1945. The war was almost over. Across the Pacific, American forces were closing in. Victory felt inevitable. But in the vast, empty stretch of ocean between Guam and the Philippines, one mission would become one of the most haunting naval disasters in U.S. history. The ship was the USS Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser with a critical assignment. On board, a classified cargo, a mission so secret. Most of the crew had no idea what they were carrying. Within days, that secrecy would cost hundreds of lives. The USS Indianapolis had just completed one of the most important deliveries of the entire war. Locked inside its steel hull was a component, unlike any other weapon before it, parts of the atomic bomb. The destination? A remote island called Tinian. From there, history would change forever, but the crew didn't know that. To them, it was just another high-speed mission. No escort, no delay, no questions. The Indianapolis moved fast, cutting through the Pacific waters at over 17 knots. The urgency was clear. This cargo mattered, and they delivered it successfully. No celebration, no recognition, just new orders. Head to Leyte in the Philippines alone. At the time, the Pacific Ocean was still dangerous. Japanese submarines were known to patrol the area, but oddly, no escort ships were assigned. No zigzagging orders were enforced, either a common evasive maneuver used to avoid submarines. The assumption? The waters were safe enough. That assumption would prove deadly. On the 30th of July, just after midnight, everything changed. The ocean was calm. The sky was dark. Most of the crew was asleep. Suddenly, a flash beneath the surface. A Japanese submarine, I-58, had been waiting. 2 torpedoes tore through the water. The first struck the bow. The second hit near the fuel tanks. What followed was chaos. An explosion ripped through the ship. Flames erupted instantly. Fuel ignited. Within seconds, the USS Indianapolis was no longer a warship. It was a burning, sinking wreck. Men were thrown from their bunks. Others trapped below deck. There was no time, no organized evacuation, no clear orders. Just panic. The ship began to list heavily, tilting, sinking faster than anyone expected. 12 minutes? That's all it took. 12 minutes for a massive warship to disappear beneath the ocean. Around 300 men went down with the ship, but nearly 900 survived the initial sinking, floating scattered, lost in the vast Pacific. And that's when the real nightmare began. No one knew they were missing. No distress signal had been properly received. No rescue mission was launched. So the Navy, the USS Indianapolis, had simply failed to arrive. And in the open ocean, nearly 900 men were left alone. They clung to life jackets, debris, anything that could keep them afloat. The sun rose, and with it, the brutal reality of their situation. No food, no fresh water, no shelter, just miles of endless ocean. At first, there was hope. Surely someone would come. Surely the Navy would notice. But as hours turned into a full day, that hope began to fade. The ocean was silent. No ships, no planes, nothing. And then something appeared beneath the surface. At first, just shadows, then movement, then fins, sharks drawn by the explosions. The oil, the blood, what had started as a survival situation was about to become something far more terrifying. The men tried to stay calm. They grouped together, kicked their legs slowly, avoided splashing. But the ocean was no longer empty. It was alive. And watching as night fell again, exhaustion set in. Men drifted apart. Some hallucinated, others drank seawater, driven mad by thirst. Discipline began to break down, and in the darkness, the attacks began one by one. Men vanished. A splash, a scream, then silence. The ocean gave no warning, no mercy. By the second day, the survivors were no longer just fighting the elements. They were fighting fear, dehydration, exposure, delirium, and something circling just beneath them, waiting. Still, no rescue came. No one knew. No one was coming. What happened next would become one of the most horrifying survival stories ever recorded at sea. Because the men of the USS Indianapolis, by the second day, the ocean no longer felt like a place of survival. It felt like a trap. The sun rose high above the survivors, merciless and unrelenting. There was no shade, no escape, just endless heat reflecting off the water. Lips cracked, skin burned. Eyes swollen from salt and sunlight, and the thirst became unbearable. At first, the men had tried to stay organized. Small groups formed. They held onto each other both for strength and safety, because they had already learned something terrifying. The farther you drifted from the group, the more likely you were to disappear. But the ocean doesn't stay still. Currents pulled them apart slowly, silently. Men who were side by side just hours before were now alone, and alone was dangerous. Hunger was constant, but thirst was worse. Some tried to ration their energy. Others couldn't take it. One by one, men began to drink seawater. At first, it seemed like relief. But soon, it turned into madness. Seawater poisoning doesn't kill instantly, it breaks you. Men began hallucinating. They saw ships that weren't there, islands just beyond reach, fresh water floating in the distance. Some laughed uncontrollably, others screamed. A few simply slipped away from the group, convinced they could swim to safety. They were never seen again, and beneath them, the sharks were still there. At first, the attacks were occasional. A sudden splash, a violent thrash, then nothing. But as time passed, the frequency increased. The predators had learned something. This wasn't just debris in the water, this was food. The survivors could feel it. That constant, creeping awareness that something was moving below them, watching, waiting. They tried everything to stay alive. They tightened their groups, kept their legs still, whispered instead of shouted. Anything to avoid drawing attention, but the ocean had already marked them. At night, the fear became worse. The darkness erased everything. No horizon, no sense of direction, just black water stretching in every direction and sounds. Unseen movements beneath the surface, soft splashes, sudden screams, then silence again. Sleep was impossible. Exhaustion took over, but letting go meant drifting away, and drifting away meant death. By the third day, the numbers had dropped drastically. Bodies floated among the living. Some men held on to them, too weak to let go, or too afraid to be alone. Others pushed them away, knowing what came next. Because the sharks always returned, the line between survival and surrender began to blur. Men stopped speaking, stopped reacting. Some simply closed their eyes and slipped beneath the surface without a sound. Still no rescue, no ships on the horizon, no planes in the sky, nothing. Far away, the Navy remained unaware. The USS Indianapolis had never reported its sinking. No one noticed it was missing. No alarms were raised. It was as if the ship and its crew had vanished from existence. Back in the water, the survivors were running out of time. Their bodies were shutting down. Dehydration, salt poisoning, exposure. Each hour took more lives. But then, something changed. On the fourth day, a faint sound broke the silence. At first, no one believed it. It had to be another hallucination, another cruel trick of the mind. But the sound grew louder, a distant engine, a low hum cutting through the empty sky. For the first time in days, the survivors looked up, and what they saw would determine who lived and who would be lost. At first, it didn't feel real. A distant hum echoed across the sky. Some of the men barely reacted. They had heard things before, sounds that weren't there. Hope had become dangerous. But this time, it was different. The sound didn't fade. It grew louder. High above the Pacific, a U.S. Navy patrol plane was flying a routine mission. There was no search operation, no distress call guiding them. Just coincidence, just chance. As the aircraft moved across the open ocean, something caught the pilot's eye, a strange pattern on the water. Debris, oil, and then movement. Men, hundreds of them, scattered across the ocean, barely alive. The pilot circled back immediately. What he saw below was almost impossible to process. Bodies floating, motionless. Others weakly waving their arms. Clusters of survivors, surrounded by empty space. It was clear this wasn't just a wreck. This was a disaster. A radio message was sent out instantly. Rescue required. Mass casualties. Location confirmed. For the first time in nearly 4 days, someone knew. Back in the water, the survivors saw the plane. Some cried, some tried to stand in the water, too weak to stay upright, others simply stared, unable to believe it, because after days of silence, help had finally arrived, but rescue wouldn't be immediate. The plane could not land safely in those conditions. And nearby ships were still hours away. Then something unexpected happened. A second aircraft arrived, a seaplane. Its pilot made a decision that would later be called both reckless and heroic. He chose to land. The ocean was rough. Waves crashed against the aircraft as it touched down. It wasn't designed for a rescue like this, but none of that mattered. There were men in the water, and they were dying. The plane taxied through the debris field. Crew members began pulling survivors on board, one after another. Some were too weak to climb. Others slipped from their grasp. Time was running out. Soon, the aircraft was overloaded. There was no more room inside, but the rescue didn't stop. Survivors were tied to the wings, strapped across the fuselage, held onto anything they could. The plane had become a floating lifeline. Hours later, rescue ships finally arrived. They moved carefully through the water, pulling survivors aboard, lifting broken bodies out of the ocean, providing water medical aid safety. But for many, it was too late. Out of nearly 900 men who had survived the sinking, only 316 were rescued. Hundreds had been lost to dehydration, exposure, salt poisoning, and the sharks. The ocean slowly returned to silence. The debris drifted away, and the USS Indianapolis was gone, but the story didn't end there, because back on land, a different kind of storm was beginning. One, not of water, but of blame. How could a U.S. Navy ship disappear without anyone noticing? Why was no rescue mission launched sooner? And who would be held responsible? For the survivors, the nightmare was over. When the survivors finally reached land, they expected relief instead. They were met with questions, sharp, cold, relentless. How did this happen? Why did the ship sink so quickly? Why was there no distress signal? Behind closed doors, the U.S. Navy faced a harsh reality. A ship had vanished, hundreds of men had died, and no one had even noticed for days. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a failure. Records revealed something disturbing. The USS Indianapolis had been reported overdue, but the message was ignored. Multiple warnings had been missed. Opportunities to act lost in paperwork and assumptions. But instead of focusing on those failures, attention shifted to one man, Captain Charles McVay. He had survived the sinking. Now, he would face the consequences. The accusation that he had failed to zigzag, a maneuver used to make ships harder targets for submarines. But the truth wasn't so simple. Zigzagging was often left to the captain's discretion, and on that night, visibility was low, the threat unclear. Still, the Navy needed accountability, and Captain McVay became the center of it in a highly unusual move. He was court-martialed, put on trial for the loss of his own ship. Even more shocking, the prosecution brought in the commander of the Japanese submarine that had attacked the Indianapolis. A former enemy called to testify. His statement was clear. Zigzagging would not have changed the outcome. He still would have fired. He still would have hit. But despite that testimony, Captain McVay was found guilty. For the families of the lost, it created a narrative, a single man to blame. A reason for an unthinkable loss. But for the survivors, it didn't sit right. They knew what happened, they lived it, and many believed the system had failed. Not their captain. Years passed, but the weight of that verdict never faded. Captain McVay carried it with him every day. Letters arrived constantly, some from families seeking answers, others filled with anger, grief, turned into blame. He rarely spoke publicly, rarely defended himself. The silence became part of his life. Then, in 1968, more than 2 decades after the sinking, Captain Charles McVay took his own life. The tragedy of the USS Indianapolis had claimed another victim, but the story didn't end there, because those who survived never forgot. In the years that followed, survivors began to speak out. They shared their experiences, their memories, their truth. They pushed back against the official narrative, demanded a second look, asked the question no one wanted to answer: was Captain McVay truly responsible? The fight for justice had begun. And it would take decades before the world was ready to listen.